Today I'm building an ice bucket for my BarCart that I built in a previous video. Now this isn't going to be built in any traditional water holding type of manner. It's just a prop for looks to add some visual interest to my cart. So with that in mind, let's get started. I saved you the pain of watching me mill all the wood down to thickness. We are about at 3/4 of an inch here. I have a stop set up on my miter gauge to cut all the bores to the same length. I then rip them to a width that is a little oversized than what I need. This is just to get them squared up into a manageable size. Now I need a dado to hold the bottom of the bucket, and this dado is set in at an angle because the bucket is tapered. I figured this angle out when I designed the bucket, so let's jump over to Sketchup and I'll give you a quick overview of how I came up with the size and the angles for this bucket. So the quick rundown is I started out drawing the proportions of the bucket where it will reside in the BarCart. This was just to get an idea of the size. Then I used the scale tool to taper the bottom. I then went through a little iteration to get to the final size and shape and was able to use the overall shape of the bucket to isolate a single stave. I used solid tools to cut the dado from the bottom, and from there I was able to use the protractor tool to get all my measurements for the angles. If you are interested in a more detailed explanation of how I designed and drew the bucket, please check out my other video where I go through it step by step. If you are interested in learning SketchUp, I teach an online SketchUp course that you can check out as well. I'll put links in the description below. So back to the build. I cut the dados to their angle, and I should mention that one thing you should always do is use a throat plate when operating a table saw. Now I set up a jig to cut the staves to their proper angle. This is a compound cut, so the blade is angled and the stop on the jig is angled as well. This cuts the compound angle required to have the staves wrap around the curvature of the bucket and to create the tapered shape of the bucket. That first pass cut the angle on one side. Then I had to reset my jig by moving the stop to the front and realign the fence to create a mirrored angle on the opposite side. I did a test fit. It was almost perfect, but something just felt a little off. But a light pass on the joiner fixed it all up, and after a little bit of fiddling around, it all closed up perfectly. I moved on to cutting the bottom out on the bandsaw, and then cleaned it up at the disc sander. I tipped the disc sander table to the same angle as the dado. This seemed like a quick way to add the needed back bevel on the bottom edge. One final test fit before moving on to finish. I wanted the bucket to have a worn look to it, like it had been filled with coal from the mine. So I laid the pieces out on the floor and took a torch to it to add some color. There are a lot of pieces to spread the glue, so to extend my working time, I used a slow set epoxy to glue it all together. And I just used some tape and band clamps to hold it together while the epoxy set. The next step was to add some wood strips to act as bands. Now I realized that traditional wood buckets are not glued together. They are wedged inside the rings, and then when water is added, it swells up to make a tight fit. But remember, this is just a prop. It's just to add some design to the BarCart. I beveled the ends of the bands at the disc sander so when I glued it together they would look seamless. While the glue dried on the bands, I drilled the holes for the rope handle. I used an ebonizing treatment of steel wool dissolved in vinegar and hydrogen peroxide to blacken the bands. Then I tapped and glued them into place. To finish the bucket, I used epoxy and wiped it down. I don't normally finish my pieces with an epoxy adhesive, but when I cleaned up the squeeze out from gluing the staves together, I realized that I really liked the look of the epoxy on the burnt wood. So I just went with it. The last thing to do was to tie up the handle. And there we go. We have a nice wooden stave ice bucket for our miner's bar cart.